Welcome, everybody. This is the Lower Makefield Township Planning Commission meeting for September 1st, 2020. The first call to order tonight's meeting. First item on our agenda is the approval of minutes from the August 10th, 2020 meeting. Did everyone have a chance to review? Any comments, questions, corrections? Hearing none, any motion to approve those minutes?
I'll make a motion that we approve the minutes from the last meeting.
Can I get a second?
A second.
All right. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed? Motion passes. The next item up is the Saldo Ordinance Amendment discussion on design guidelines in office, commercial, mixed-use districts. So just as a refresher, we started talking about design guidelines for mixed-use development and how they can be best implemented in the township and used to the township's benefit back in, looks like early February. And on the February 10th, 2020 meeting minutes, there's a good rundown in the public record on that discussion and how it came to be that we're in the state of considering this and talking through design guidelines. At that meeting, we broke the subject down into four separate parts. Craig Bryson originally handled architectural guidelines. Dawn, you had public realm. Tony, you signed up for parking and circulation. I think, Adrian, you and I are going to handle landscape and hardscape guidelines. And so tonight's discussion is going to be about parking and circulation. And I believe, Tony, you have a presentation that you're going to share.
I do. Well, I guess I do. Okay. So in thinking about parking design and circulation, I guess what seems intuitive is that functionality is most important. Aesthetics is also very important, and environmental concerns are important as well. In terms of functionality, I think in my mind what seemed very important was having adequate entrances and exits, flow within the parking lot spaces being sufficient in size, and pedestrian safety. So it occurred to me that maybe a good starting point would be to look at what we already have in the town in several commercial lots. And Jim, if you could help put this up, because I am having a real hard time with that right now. I'm not on my normal computer. The first of the two PDFs I sent you. Okay, so this is a little bit of a blurry picture that we're looking at, but it is of the Shoprite parking lot. And I think of all the local parking lots, probably most people in town would agree that it is not the best of designs. There's not a lot of places for pedestrian walkways. There are no pedestrian walkways within the parking lot itself. Traffic flow is not particularly good when it's crowded. The rear of the parking lot away from the center, away from the supermarket, has poor traffic flow. The size of the spots and even the cartway widths don't seem adequate when driving on them. I know in our last meeting, there was discussion that perhaps the parkway, it's not the, whether it's the the width of the cartway or the width of the parking spot, there's some variable in getting the right ratio of those right. But I think in that lot, the spots do appear to be too small for most many of the larger vehicles today. Jim, could you go to the next picture there? Okay, this is another, and I apologize that these did not come out well. This is what happens when you have a lawyer who doesn't do any land use work trying to get photos of parking lots from Google. This lot, the local McCaffrey's in Lower Makefield, I think has better flow than the Shoprite. The size of the spots are certainly bigger. I think they're the 10 by 20. And it is, and the rear of the lot also has good flow. It may be not a great point of comparison because it's a smaller parking lot for a supermarket. Jim, could you go to the next slide, or the next picture, I should say.
Is that the giant shopping center?
It is. No, that was the other McCaffrey's, actually. It was the McCaffrey's in Newtown.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. This is a much bigger lot, and it serves not just a supermarket, but quite a big shopping center. And it has, I don't know if it has good traffic flow in it, both in front of the stores and at the rear of the lot, has a lot of entrances and exits to the parking lot. And the size of the spots seems to be adequate. Perhaps the only thing missing from this particular lot is good pedestrian walkways. Doesn't really, it kind of surprising because the whole shopping center was recently redone. In fact, I think that they may still be building there. I'm not 100% sure about that, but they really didn't address pedestrian walkways within the lot, which again, kind of surprising given that they just redid the lot. And then lastly, Jim, if you could go to the Giant parking lot. This is Giant's parking lot in Lower Makefield. I think it has good flow throughout the lot. There was some discussion in our last meeting, and I think we got clarity, but Jim, you had mentioned at one point you thought the spots closer to the building were larger, and then corrected that and said they were uniform throughout the parking lot. Is that the case there?
Yes.
It is. Okay. Because the idea that you mentioned actually sounds like a really good one. I don't know if our existing ordinance even addresses it, but it's something that we may want to consider in these design guidelines, that size of parking spots closer to the building are larger, and maybe halfway through the lot, they get smaller. I'm guessing that it might cause problems with impervious surface, so could be some flexibility with that. So those are generally the larger lots in town. I think most of them, none of them are new lots. None of them adequately address pedestrian safety. Some, to varying degrees, have good flow and good parking lot size. But all things to keep in mind when we go through this process. And then here's where I kind of fell down a little bit. I received something from Andy back in July, which I did not realize did not go to all of us, and I didn't realize it till late today. That was the other document that Jim had put up before, and it's from Montgomery County. It is the Montgomery County Sustainable Green and Parking Lots publication. And when I look at this, I think we really shouldn't be reinventing the wheel here. What Andy provided to us really puts forth a lot of information about historical problems with parking lots and how to make them better. It provides a terrific roadmap. And I'm not sure, Andy, if any communities in Bucks County have adopted this, or for that matter, whether any in Montgomery County have adopted it, but it looked terrific to me. It goes through some of the problems with older designs of parking lots, that they're urban heat islands, that they are bad for water quality, stormwater management, don't necessarily have a lot of character, don't have the best lighting, and maybe don't focus enough on driver and pedestrian safety. They kind of hit all the points that you'd want to hit in terms of describing problems. And it lays out pretty clearly a proposed basically ordinance, essentially, on page 41 of this document. And my thought was that we sort of model something a lot like this. And I realized that none of you have seen this document before, and for that I apologize. But none of you except Andy and maybe Jim. But it goes through the purpose and intent, the applicability, and then real specifics in terms of plantings and things of that sort. How to plant them, where to plant them, appropriate number of parking islands, what islands should look like, how big they should be, all of those things. And it's not the kind of thing that I, without an engineering background, can really comment on a lot of the specific detail, but I think it looks good. And I honestly looked for some other examples, didn't really find too many that looked as good as this one. So Andy, I don't know if you had done a comprehensive search or not, but you found a good sample for us, or model for Lower Makefield.
No, I didn't specifically do a comprehensive search. I mean, I was familiar with this because I have it as one of my standards for when, we get involved with land development, and we're mindful of it. And the only thing that I would caution against is that, the idea, the Green Sustainable Parking Guide, it's a guide for a reason. It's not a mandatory manual or requirement. There's certain sites, whether it has, based on the type of soil, where this wouldn't work, based on the slope of the parking lot, it wouldn't work. So there's certain criteria that a site would have to meet just kind of coming out of the gate, that where the ideas expressed in this guideline could be implemented. The whole idea is really to take the runoff from the parking lot and get it into these parking islands in between the spaces. And so you don't have the spaces kind of abutting against each other at the front. You have a gap with a vegetated swale in the middle. So then the stormwater runoff is hitting the parking lot and then getting to a green space before then ultimately getting into an inlet and being channeled to the regional stormwater management system for the entire development. So it's a way of addressing water quality prior to getting to the flood control basin, so to speak.
So, Andy, I have a question about that, and then I have a larger point about something else you mentioned, but specifically about that island with the vegetative island. Could you put a sidewalk in there? And I'm thinking through, Tony, you in the presentation you gave both in the same. Well, there are two different shopping centers, but the one by the Lower Makefield Township, McCaffrey's. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there's sidewalks in between some parking spaces that promote pedestrian traffic. And then on the flip side, on the Giant parking lot, I don't think there's any, which prohibits easy pedestrian traffic. But the trade-off to me there is on the Giant, it's possible to pull through and go through more easily, and the sidewalk breaks up the ability to do that. So there's a trade-off. So back to my question for Andy was, could there be a sidewalk in that, or does that prohibit the benefits of the runoff retention or management, I should say? And then the larger question of how does that affect flow? Is it an advantage because there's better possible pedestrian flow, or is it a disadvantage because traffic flow is at a disadvantage?
Well, a savvy design engineer would be able to work around that. I mean, I think that, that's why this is a guideline. If you want a walking space down the middle, well, then you could have stone and have like an underground seepage bed or a trench underneath the walking surface, where water then gets into the stone layer, goes down underground, and then infiltrates into the ground that way. And then you have your walking path on top, which would essentially achieve the same, a similar result. But then there's also, or you could have porous paving within the parking spaces. You don't typically want porous paving within the driveway aisle because you get more vehicle loads on the driveway aisle. At the parking spaces, vehicles sit there and they park and they're not moving, so it doesn't create such a strong load on anything that's underneath. So typically you could put porous paving within the parking spaces and then have an underground stone vault that would infiltrate water into the ground that way. So there's various ways around it. I think the other important factor would be planting trees within those islands. Trees take up a lot of water, but they also kind of cool down the pavement. They provide more shade for the pavement. And so that's another benefit that is implemented or it is expressed in these guidelines.
So I have a question based on what Andy was just saying and looking at the Lower Makefield corporate campus north side where they're doing that internal, where they ripped up a huge chunk of the parking lot and they put in an internal green space with pedestrian walkway. And is that similar to what you're referring to, Andy?
That's more of a rectangular in shape, and that's significant in size. That's almost like a lawn plaza area that they're doing over there. This would be more like I would say 5 to 8 foot wide aisle along down the middle of each, or at the end of each parking stall or parking bank of stalls, and then so.
If just picking up on what you said, Andy, I mean, looking through these materials from Montgomery County, if you put those islands at the ends of the parking aisles, you could still have the walkway between the cars.
Correct.
And you can sort of accomplish both ends at the same time.
Yeah, and I think that if we're putting it in an ordinance, then we can say that these measures are encouraged. I don't know that we can specifically require them without understanding exactly if that site if it's feasible for that site.
I have a question. Are we just talking about right now the large parking lot that would specifically service whatever grocery store or whatever winds up being in this space?
I would say that you're talking about every parking area.
Yeah, correct me if I'm wrong, anybody, but it's my understanding that we're talking about the subdivision and land development ordinance that is currently enacted in Lower Makefield Township, and suggesting an amendment to that to incorporate these design guidelines to be implemented on any new development or any rehab of an existing development. And we had a discussion about that earlier in the year about what exactly would qualify as a rehab. And we came to, I think, a conclusion that it would, anything that involves actually displacing dirt, it's more than just painting a new facade, or it's more than just cosmetic, but an actual redevelopment that involves displacement of dirt, these guidelines would apply. And the intent being that with having the design guidelines within the Saldo, developers or redevelopers could always seek a waiver of them, but it's setting a minimum standard that we think is a comprehensive guideline for the township and for development of the township. Do I have that correct?
Mhm. Yes.
Ross, the only question I have about that is we have the traditional neighborhood development overlay, which covers Edgewood Village, and I think that's bigger than most people are thinking. I think it covers both the Giant and McCaffrey's parking lot or super shopping centers as well.
Well, that would be if those requirements are more stringent than the Saldo requirements, then the developers would need to adhere to that rather than the Saldo, right?
I think so. I mean, I think they're more stringent.
Yeah, and if I may add, there are some items in our current ordinance that regulate off-street parking and parking lots. Back in 2006, when Lower Makefield embarked on implementing low-impact development standards, one of the things we recognized was large parking lots, rather than just being a sea of pavement, should try to incorporate wherever possible some green areas, especially where you have the opportunities for infiltration. And one of the items we have in there is that they should try to incorporate infiltration and bioretention areas wherever possible in order to allow water to sheet flow from the parking lot into that. Traditional parking lot typically has the water run off over the asphalt, go to a storm drainage inlet, and get piped to a stormwater management system. And a slightly better way to treat water from a water quality perspective is to have some of that water go into a vegetated area. That vegetated area tends to absorb some of the water, and then it goes into an inlet and then goes off to be treated for the rate of runoff so it doesn't flood people downstream. So we do have that in the ordinance, which sort of aligns with the standards that Tony presented from the Montgomery County, thank you, Planning Commission. So we have that in there, and also we have some items in there about pedestrian crosswalks and refuge islands are required to be implemented wherever possible, like every 200 feet in a parking area, so that you can have places where people could potentially walk. But these guidelines are more comprehensive in Montgomery County, and they do, it's sort of in a layman's way explains what we're trying to do. And I think a lot of them are kind of what we want to do. We want to try to not have a sea of parking where we don't need to, unless there was some other reason to do it. Like in the corporate center, the North Campus, they had the parking sort of broken up, and they wanted to make the big green area. So that sort of pushed the pavement around to the sides of the building. But in the middle, you got the big green space area, which is also in the Montgomery County guidelines, where you should try to add some green space, which is also something that's in the traditional neighborhood development or T&D overlay, that they require a little bit of green space here and there just to break up asphalt.
So for instance, a sample language in the ordinance would be, no more than, pick a number, 10, 12 parking spaces in a row without having a dedicated green space. So theoretically, you would have 10 parking spaces, and then the width of one parking space would be a planter island where you could put in mulch, perennials, a tree, and then another 10 spaces, something like that. A planter island shall be incorporated into into parking lot design for every 10 parking spaces.
And the ordinance currently has that. We put every 20 spaces. So you can only go 20 spaces in a row before you need to break it up with a green area. Basically an island with a couple of trees just to minimize that heat island impact that you get for a big, vast area of asphalt.
So if I'm thinking about the giant parking lot, and perhaps I need to pull up the picture again, but I don't think any of those breakup elements are in there. Was that grandfathered in, or am I maybe misremembering what that parking lot looks like?
You are correct. Those elements are not in there. That one predated the ordinance that actually put that in. If you look at the giant supermarket, they do have the green island running down the center in one area, but for the most part, they just have a couple of green areas up front and in the back, and the rest are like that. And that might actually be 20 spaces though.
This possibly would not pass today under the current ordinance.
Yes.
The design guidelines aside.
Correct.
Okay.
We would be looking for something just slightly different. Some of the problems they have with these islands is that they make them a little bit too small. So then the problem you have is selecting the right variety of tree that won't, the roots won't heave the parking lot, outgrow it. You have to be resistant to salt, and all sorts of elements have to be incorporated in the landscape plan to make sure that you get something a little bit nicer.
Jim, I had said at the beginning, sort of in very layman's terms, I thought that traffic flow at the back of the parking lot was important. But from an engineering standpoint, what sort of things are needed to make that happen?
Well, it all depends on the configuration of the site. A couple of these sites, like the Edgewood Village Shopping Center where McCaffrey's is, that site's kind of really tight between the buildings and Heacock Road. You don't have a lot of room. So you have the driveway aisle that runs in front of the stores, and in most cases, not very many spaces until you hit that back driveway spaces. That one's kind of a tight one. The same with Shoprite. There's not a lot of room between the buildings and where Big Oak Road is. So, and the way it's laid out, you basically, all cars go just on that aisle that is right in front of all of the stores. Whereas McCaffrey's is laid out a little bit better in that you could come in off of Heacock Road and go down that back aisle parallel to Heacock Road before you turn down to your parking area. So you can come in from two directions. You can come in from along the building, or you can come in from the rear.
Having multiple entrances without being funneled in one spot is something we'd be looking for.
Yeah. Because, all right, so I'm actually glad that we're starting to talk about this, because I feel like out of everything we do, if we're going to leave something that's beneficial for the township, it's as much as I'm usually always the tree and green guy, the biggest priority here is giving our township better parking lots from a functional standpoint, because we have a lot of subpar ones, in my opinion, at least in the commercial areas. I don't know much about the like Polo Run and some of the apartment areas, but I think it'd be better to focus on what are the things we need. Oh, sorry. Sorry, did I lose you guys?
No, we can hear you.
No,
Okay, sorry. Something else just happened to my computer. Hold on. Let me get you back on screen. All right, but I think I would like to start talking about what do we need to have an effective parking lot? What are the widths? What are the aisle widths? What are the egress and the ingress into the parking lot and the pedestrian flows working with those cars? And then talk about what we can do to effectively mix in the green space and the trees and things like that. Because I think if we give something that, even just use this one development that we're talking about, if we give them if we give them a parking lot that looks pretty but works just as crappily as the rest of them, then nobody's gonna be happy, and we're not gonna have done our job, I don't think. So like I look at, you could put all the green space you want and meet every requirement that's in the Shoprite parking lot, but until you improve, you can forget about parking spaces. Until you improve traffic flow, you're not doing anything good for that parking lot. That's my opinion.
Actually, Tony hit the nail on the head right from the start with his several points. You know, functionality is the first key, and that's
Has to be.
a function of access, flow, parking lot size, pedestrian safety. I mean, that is the key thing. The environmental aspect's also important, and so are other things. But functionality is number one, and which goes into safety.
Yeah, and so I just don't want to. I don't want to like say like us sit here and talk about all the screen and like requirements every 10 space. We put an island or whatever, and then all of a sudden we get to talking about the functional part, and there's a tree in the way of where the entrance to the parking lot should be. You know what I mean?
I think, just having, designed a few parking lots and laying out a few parking lots, how we generally approach it is if you've got a 100 by 50 foot space, or not 50, but say you got a 500 by 400 foot space. Well, then you look at that and as a rectangle, and you start, okay, I'm going to put parking spaces around the perimeter of the edges. Then I'm going to, and the standard parking space size is 9 feet wide by 18 feet long. And then we use typically a 24-foot wide aisle width. So then I'm going to line up my aisles along the 500-foot distance. And because, you'll be able to fit more spaces if the aisles are going in the longest direction. And so then that's pretty much typically how you lay it out. And then everything else that I was talking about as far as adding green swales in between the parking spaces, well, then that just reduces the number of aisles that you can put in there.
Okay. Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
A question out of ignorance then. When you start to implement more green elements and other pedestrian friendly elements, and you have a certain parking lot that is there's only so much room to fit so many spaces, then do you start to run into a problem of not having enough spaces for a designated retail shop can also be problematic? And how to Adrian's point about making sure that we're not doing harm by trying to do good, does that element ever come into play of how do we make sure that we're not shooting ourselves in the foot by forcing a developer to not have enough spaces for the space?
Well, the code, right. So the code establishes how many parking spaces are required for each use based on the square footage of that use. And so I would think that you don't want to limit that, or you don't want to do anything that would bring it down under that.
Yep.
Do you find in your experience that most developers seek to meet the minimum requirement but not go in excess of any additional parking spaces, or is that such a developer by developer, store by store type situation that it's impossible to say what any person would, that universally everybody seeks just the minimum, or is that not true?
No, I don't think that it's been my experience that they look at it from a practical standpoint and say, okay, here's what the minimum is, but we anticipate that this is going to be a high traffic area. And so we're going to allow for more parking spaces. Or, for a shopping center, they're going to allow for more parking spaces so that they can have cart corrals out in the parking lot. And they're going to allow for those spaces. So, yeah, it's been my experience that they've looked at it from a practical standpoint. And let me get back to another thing that kind of ties into what you were saying, Ross. You can always reduce the square footage of the building if you don't have enough space to get the parking spaces in there.
Right.
That could be part of the requirement.
I think for me, again, this just shows my ignorance of the economics of designing and building a parking lot that's appropriate for the space. But if I was a developer, I would think through larger spaces are better because it would be more, two equal shopping centers. The shopping center that is more easy for a consumer to enter and exit without risk of danger of being a pedestrian or danger of hitting another car seems more attractive. But obviously that's not the case because we've already talked about this evening a shopping center in town where we believe that it is prohibitive to try to park there, and it makes it less attractive. But that wasn't, obviously having more spaces there was more attractive to that developer at that time. So it's trying to understand the different forces here. And your input is very valuable. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, one thing to note, a lot of developers, they look at it several ways. Some of their ultimate users, like a CVS or maybe a Kohl's, not our Kohl's, but if they're building a new one in town, they sometimes want more than what's the minimum amount of parking that's required by the ordinance. So they don't go to the bare minimum to maximize the square footage. They have a square footage in mind of what they feel is appropriate for the area. And then for the parking, they may go beyond the minimum because they want to have that appearance that we have plenty of room. Come on in. It's not like rush hours on Black Friday where the parking lot's all full. The CVS, when they did that, they actually added in more spaces than were required. I remember I tried to convince them to just get the absolute minimum, but it was a marketing thing on their end that the extra 10 spaces would just make the parking lot look more attractive because it would be open. People who don't want to park next to someone could move a little further away.
Yeah, and I would say that it is a balance too, because there are times where developers they want to minimize the impervious surface area. One, we put a restriction on the impervious surface. Number two, the more impervious surface they have, the more money they have to spend on stormwater management to make the systems bigger. And to a developer, that's dead money.
One thing we haven't discussed yet is lighting. And I know, Tony, you mentioned it. And I will say I'm very curious to see the Montgomery design guidelines and to hear what they have about lighting. To me, that's important as well, because it's the trade-off between making sure that for safety purposes, you have adequate lighting, and that for driving, there is adequate lighting while respecting perhaps near neighbors who are going to have to be staring at a huge glowing parking lot, and how do we balance those two factors? And so to that point, I was going to say, I think that it's worth our time to, if those guidelines can be circulated, I'd be very curious to take the next 2 weeks before the next meeting, review them, and then come back and talk about what we've read.
I think that makes sense. And I would just add one other point, and Jim, you can help me out on this. if my recollection is correct, in the traditional neighborhood TND overlay, there are lighting guidelines in there, or at least there was a discussion about including them in that. And I'm wondering, are those still current? That was done over a decade ago. Should that be, if we're looking at that now, lighting design guidelines, should it, whatever we do now, also be included in that as well, or include that area as well?
Well, there's two different thoughts on lighting. One is to minimize the number of poles, reduce any chance of glare, and that would require the higher lights that are taller. They spread light out more evenly, use LED lights, and you don't see the fixture unless you're staring right at it. Such as a standard parking lot light, a 30-foot tall light covers more area. In the T&D, they wanted to make it look more like a village. There they use the lantern style lights. The issue with those is that you get a lot of glare. And you can see, like when Di Lorenzo's first opened up, I know the reaction of everyone was like, oh my God, what is this? But after a little while, you get used to it. The lights burn in a little bit, so they lose that real brightness. And some of the vegetation that's planted grows in a couple of years and just softens the glow from those lights. So I think there's two ways of doing it. And in something like the Prick Preserve property, the larger parking lots should definitely be the 30-foot tall lights, the standard ones, to try to minimize the number of light fixtures, minimize glare. But when you get into more of the smaller areas with plazas, that should be more the pedestrian scale, lantern style light, where it looks more attractive.
Do we have a dark sky requirement in the ordinance? Like dark sky lighting, just glowing down.
We do have glare requirements that light must be cast down and all that good stuff. Like I said, a lantern light tends to do that. That doesn't throw light up into the sky, but it just, sort of like more at eye level that you see it.
Okay, because I know there are specific fixtures, commercially and residentially, just specifically designed to be dark sky, like essentially if you're looking down on it, you don't see anything but the splash on the ground.
At this point, I can see 3 stars from my backyard, and I'd like to keep those 3.
Yes, exactly.
I heard there's more. I don't know for sure, but yeah.
Yeah, I will say this too, that the ordinance already does have a section where it limits the number of foot candles that you can have at the property line. And so that would prevent any kind of spillage light from the development. I mean, there's not a lot of neighbors on this on the Prick Preserve site, but in other areas, it does limit the amount of foot candles that can spill over the property.
Yeah, but I mean, just it doesn't have neighbors, but there are a couple of times a year where there are a lot of people in the area go there to see light shows and things like that, where you don't want to all of a sudden see this big glow from across the street either, right?
Right. And we have those requirements in the ordinance. And you're required to do a lighting plan, make sure that the lights cast downward. It's not like a spotlight on an old warehouse building that shines out into the parking lot, but and that's why the taller lights are actually better, because then it casts the light downward, that you don't have it interfere with people's vision. And one thing I remember, when they did the Caddis project, the assisted living facility on Dovery Road, they proposed to put in the lantern style lighting, and it looked really good. And then once they turned them on, some of the neighbors complained about the glare and everything. Now, part of that's because they accidentally took down vegetation they weren't supposed to, which they will be replanting. but part of it's just the nature of the lantern style lights.
Mhm.
And then for the 2 people who complained about that, I had 3 more phone calls saying it looks absolutely beautiful over there because it looks more like a village with the lantern style lightings. And so you have that trade-off, and some people love it, some people don't.
Jim, what kind of lighting is over at the senior center?
I don't recall. I think it's just
At which senior center?
our community center.
Yeah, our community center.
Community center.
I think it's just regular, like, tall fluorescent lighting.
Yeah, it's tall lighting.
Yeah, I think 30-foot poles or 25-foot poles cast downward.
Yeah.
So this is what you're talking about for here? You would suggest the same kind of lighting here?
Yeah, in the larger parking lot areas. But when you get into the more where you're going to try to get pedestrians and everything, then a lantern style light would just look prettier, like you have in all of these type of developments.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, just in looking at Google Earth, it appears that the ones over at the community center are the Cobra head style, or where it's it doesn't look like it's a 30-foot tall pole. Might be 20. But yeah, it's got the fixture recessed in the roof of. It's got the light recessed into the roof of the fixture and then shines down.
And Jim, you mentioned the problem with the one development and the vegetation being cut down. And in the session, we're obviously going to talk about hardscaping and landscaping, and to the extent that landscaping can be can incorporate or at least contemplate aiding the lighting issues that might be created by certain types of light. That's worth coming back to at that point in time when we discuss that, if at all possible. So I think that we've reached a point where we could clearly talk for the rest of the evening about the different elements here. But given that I think it would be to the Planning Commission's advantage to review that Montgomery County guideline and then come back to discuss with things that we liked and things we didn't like. And not to draw this out, our goal at the beginning of the year was to get through the design guidelines by the end of 2020. At that point in time, we had no idea that we were going to be remote and we were going to be on pause for quite a bit of time. So I don't know if we want to still try to hold to that timeline or give us a little bit of a slack. But I think that it's given the importance to Adrian's point, to everyone's point about the importance of parking among all of these elements. It's worth our time to come back and discuss. Maybe we open up for public comment if there are any tonight. It'd be helpful to hear if anybody's been watching and has thoughts on this. But to review those guidelines and come back in our next session and review that more closely, and then push off landscaping, hardscaping for the session after that if we don't have a full agenda and if we have the time and availability to do so. Thoughts?
I think a good idea.
Sounds like a good plan.
Yep, sounds like a good plan.
The only other thing that I would add is that is this discussion solely parking lots? Do we want to talk? There is commercial areas, and in the plaza areas where I would expect that restaurants would want some type of outdoor seating, especially given the events of this summer. And so is that going to be part of this discussion? That certainly was not in any of the information that I sent over to Tony. But, minimum width of sidewalks and things like that might be something that we want to think about as well.
And not just there was the discussion early on back in February and also tied into the overlay that we've been discussing about the advantages and disadvantages of what's deemed a drive-through. And the last 6 months have changed our ideas about picking up food from a non-drive-through type restaurant and having access and quick parking to be able to do so. So I think that's worthy of discussion as well.
I think we may have started the discussion when Dawn presented. I think it was when Dawn presented about outdoor seating. I don't know if we had that. I'm having a recollection that we talked about it.
That was before the COVID, so.
Maybe it was when Craig spoke, but at some point we did touch on it.
We did talk about having areas for, and this is before the COVID really hit in, just about pickup spots, people coming in for DoorDash, Uber Eats.
Oh, maybe that's what it was. Okay.
Which ties in perfectly. And then when all of this hit, I think in a subsequent meeting, someone mentioned that, wow, that was really actually almost clairvoyant talking about that in that fashion.
But outdoor seating is, I think anybody who's going to run a restaurant is going to be interested in that at that point.
So I think both outdoor seating, pickup, quote unquote, drive-through elements, other elements that aren't going to be incorporated in the Montgomery County design guidelines that the last 6 months have taught us lessons on are worth bringing to the table next time we meet to discuss. I think that's a great point, Andy. Thank you.
Yeah, I would even throw in there, potential access for public transportation or something like that. Something that you might want to consider.
And I will forward the guidelines along with some other information about what is currently in our ordinance. That's sort of a standard, which is slightly different than a guideline. A standard you have to adhere to or have a waiver versus a guideline is more of the general feel of what we want. Although there's nothing to say that if there's some of the standards or guidelines that we think are really critical, we could make those standards.
Does electric vehicle charging fall within this general discussion as well? Some of you may recall that there was discussion around that idea when we were talking about the overlay. It was referenced in terms of a bonus, and I had certain thoughts on that bonus related. I didn't think it applied, but it might be very relevant to this discussion, where I find it much more attractive to at least have that discussion and consider the benefits and disadvantages of implementing that element in there as well.
I agree. Some people even have Teslas.
Good. Well, with that, should we open up to public comment and if any, hear what any viewers have to say? Any objection to that?
Nope.
Then let's move ahead, and if we have any public comment, we'd love to hear.
Who's keeping track of public calls? Jim, do you know?
Our IT people and television people.
Okay.
Sorry, guys, no public comment.
Perfect. That's easy. Andy or Tony, would you be kind enough to circulate those guidelines? And then Jim, if you could, if there, we talked about a few other ordinances that were relevant tonight. To the extent you could either just list a few of those that we should also consider when reading through these guidelines, that might be helpful just to come to the table next time, so we're educated about what the other standards and minimum standards that are already in place are.
I can get some information on some template guidelines or template ordinances for similar stuff and send that to Jim, and then Jim, you can pick through it if you want, or just forward to the group if you wish.
Yeah, I will put together what we have on our books right now so that you could see. And then when they talk about you should incorporate buyer retention areas in the parking lots, you can see we actually have that addressed and then fine tune it from there. Same with the lighting and that stuff.
I think that'll make it a lot easier for the discussion next time. Good. With that, is there a motion to anything else or motion to adjourn?
No, I'll just tell you, I just emailed everyone tonight that's on here. No opinions, just give you an example of what I was sort of referring to with the dark sky lighting, and even in the small pedestrian areas, what I think could be workable, and maybe put something like that in. Just to me, I think it's a good idea, but I just wanted to send you an illustration to show you what I was talking about, and if it's interesting to anyone, we can talk about it next time.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay.
All right, I'll move to adjourn.
Thank you. Second. All those in favor? All right. Thank you. All those in favor?
Aye.
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 Aye. All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a great night.
Good night.
All right.
Good night.
Talk to you soon.